Shabbos! Good Shabbos! It is a good Shabbos. It's a strange Shabbos. We're in our homes. We're confined to our homes. We're looking for silver linings. My friends, we've got silver linings. Who's in the house? Who's with us today? Where are you tuning in from? Where is your home confinement happening? I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, Hancock Park neighborhood. We're home, we're with our kids, thank God. We're well, we're healthy. But these are absolutely unique times. Leslie Blicker is the first to comment. Well done, Leslie, in the house from Minnesota. Pamela Tillman, good Shabbos from the Catskills. Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Who else is with us? I shared a video a little earlier today on the page. Check it out after the show, perhaps. It's a 5-minute video from Rabbi Manis Friedman. He's been a guest on our show and on our podcast. If you've ever seen him speak or met him in person, Rabbi Friedman's amazing. He has a very long white beard, and his beard is not as long as his brain is brilliant. I mean, and he has a really long beard. But Rabbi Friedman is amazing, and his video just gives so much hope. I mean, you know, the question that he asks in the video, and that so many people ask at times like this, you know, when we see people are dying around the world. It's obviously a very small percentage, but the numbers show that as people get sick, some people die. And so whenever people die, people ask, how could God let it happen? And some people will say, I refuse to believe in a God that would let these things happen. And of course, there have been much worse tragedies from a death rate perspective in the history of the world. And how could God let such a thing happen? And Rabbi Friedman's answer is that question is completely off base. The question is off base. How could God let something happen? So that would imply that God allows some things to happen and doesn't allow other things to happen. And, you know, the question is, will God intervene or not? But the thing that is happening is just happening. And then these people are asking, will God intervene? So Rabbi Friedman rejects the question, as we all should. Nothing happens in this world that God doesn't will to happen. Now, of course, that's very difficult for us when terrible things happen, and we're like, you know, so it's not just that God let it happen, it's that this is God's plan, that somehow this terrible thing that happened or is happening is part of God's plan. And the answer is yes. It's part of God's plan. So, you know, so often we can't tell what the plan is. And we're confused and we're devastated and we're angry. And those emotions are all natural and make sense. And we should use them and harness the energy of those emotions to challenge ourselves and to challenge the situation, sometimes even to challenge God. And say, I need to understand, I need to know why is this happening? All right. So why is this being brought down? I mean, it's hard to say. But I will say this. Now, this is Sal speaking, right? You know, we've been learning in this section of our study of the Talmud in Shabbos that one must not touch a Torah. And I think spiritually speaking, I think that means that for me, when I'm teaching this Torah, I'm coming here to share it with you, to share what I've learned, and not to add or subtract from it. Okay, so I don't touch the Torah. When I share an opinion of mine, I'm not going to tell you that it's the Torah. I'm going to tell you that it's my opinion. So it is my opinion that this Kavod virus that's being sent through the world, you know, like Rabbi Friedman says, it is from God. It's going to produce good. Maybe not right now, certainly not in a family that's losing a loved one. This is not the time to tell people who are really sick and in pain or, God forbid, have lost someone. This message, you don't share it with them, right? You don't tell a mourner what the meaning of their loss is. So we're speaking in a more abstract level now. But the fact is, the world has gone in a direction for many years which is quite godless, right? God is there. God keeps providing for all of us. God makes an incredibly beautiful world. I heard today from my friend David Wolf, who was once confronted while in Israel by a militant atheist who was actually the child of a Holocaust survivor and had been taught by her mother, who lost her whole family in the Holocaust, that obviously there's no God, the Holocaust was allowed to happen. And so this woman was looking at my friend David, who's a very religious Jew and dressed like one, and said, this whole thing, this whole God thing, it's just a lie, it's nonsense. And it was almost like emotional for her. And they were in a restaurant in a hotel. And so my friend David Wolf, he said to her, isn't it amazing that we're, standing in a hotel right now that came into being spontaneously? And she said, what? He said, well, this hotel, we're in it now, but it just happened, right? No one built it, it just happened. She said, what are you talking about? Obviously people built it. He said, how do you know that? And she said, well, look around. I mean, obviously people built this. There's beams and glass and a floor, and there's design, and there's power and motors and electricity. Of course someone built that. And he said, well, then look outside the hotel and look at the intricacy of the trees and the birds and the sky and the planets fulfilling their course. You think all of that just happened? I mean, you're telling me that this little hotel could not have happened unless somebody built it? It couldn't have happened randomly? But that incredible universe outside did happen randomly? Right? So for him and for me and for Rabbi Friedman, this world is far too intricate, marvelous, and beautiful, even with all its problems, for it not to be by design. It's by design. So the question is, what would be the design? What would be the purpose of this plague that we're feeling now, that we're all experiencing, that is completely shut down? Completely shut down what we thought was our normal life. I mean, nothing that's going on right now could we have foreseen a month ago, maybe even 2 weeks ago. It's so, everything has been shaken, completely shaken. We're in a completely different form of life now. We're not sure when we're going to go back. The rug has been pulled out from under us, right? That veneer of normalcy is gone. And we realize how dependent we are on this world, for the sustenance that we get from it, on our loved ones, to have community. Right now, my heart really goes out. If you're watching this and you're homebound during the plague and you're alone, I am sending you so much love. This is so difficult. So difficult, and I'm so sorry that you're experiencing this alone. But at least for now, as long as it lasts, and may last throughout the plague, we have this live stream, this virtual medium. Thank God we have that. Let me just make sure, yeah. My do not disturb is on. But what purpose does it serve? So Rabbi Friedman is saying, look at all the good that's going to come out of it. Number one, we're going to be more grateful. Now, I've been talking a lot about the fact that the name of this plague is Kavod. Okay? It's called Kavod. Now, in Hebrew, a Hebrew speaker hears Kavod, and that word instantly evokes the Hebrew word Kavod. It sounds the same way. Some people pronounce it Kabod or Kavod, right? But if you're speaking quickly, it's Kavod. That word is often translated as honor, that you give honor to God, you give honor to Hashem, you give honor to your parents. Or it can also be like you recognize the glory, right? So you recognize that this world is not random. You recognize to whom we must be grateful. I shared a little image today from the morning prayer that we say. We wake up in this world, and if we wake up properly, as a Jew is supposed to wake up, the first words out of our mouth are, I give thanks before the living and faithful and eternal King. before the living and eternal King, who has restored my soul within me. Your faithfulness is great. God, as I've talked about before many times, God's faithfulness is great. What does that mean? We're supposed to have faith, but God has faith in us. He grants us another day because he has faith in us that we can do our job here, right? So recognizing the glory of God is something we're supposed to do immediately when we wake up, the living and eternal King, and give thanks, right? So when we give honor, when we recognize the glory, it's inseparable from giving thanks. This world has become so detached from gratitude and from that kind of acknowledgement for the gifts that we've been given that right now we're getting a strong, right? It's like a boom, 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 boom. And I mean, what I mean by that is like it's like an earthquake, right? It's a quake, it's a tremor that's being sent through the entire system. And my friends, this tremor that's being sent through the entire system, it's a wake-up call, and it is gentle. It is gentle. As weird as our lives are right now, as topsy-turvy, as upended, and as sorry as we are for the people who have been lost in this plague and who are not coming back, right? Their souls are in the world of souls. They are in the world of truth. God willing, we will join them there eventually when our lives end, but we're in no hurry to do that. But in this world, this plague is gentle. It could have been much worse. People who remember polio in the 50s that would attack the children. There's a few people living in this world who were alive during that Spanish influenza, where the mortality rate was much higher. Our history books teach us about the bubonic plague, plagues of the medieval times, when a full third of Europe died. This plague is gentle, but it is a warning signal. It's saying, wake up and give honor to the Creator, recognize his glory, and show gratitude. Do your job as a human, show gratitude to the Creator, and then act on that gratitude by taking care of your fellow human beings. Right? Taking care of the relationship between us and the Creator, and taking care of the Creator's other creatures. That's our job while we're here, making a home for God. Now, in this week's, we're going to get to the page of Talmud in a moment, but the Daf-Parsha connection this week is so strong. The Parsha this week, the Torah portion that we're going to be reading, that we would read in synagogue tomorrow, but that we've been studying all week. It's a double portion. It's Vayachel Pekudei, and it's the last reading of the book of Exodus. So in the yearly cycle, we're finishing the book of Exodus this week, specifically tomorrow. And the end of the book of Exodus is that the children of Israel, who have for so many pages now in the book of Exodus, have been putting together the tabernacle, right? First, we received the whole instruction of what we would do and what it would look like and what was needed. And then the whole thing is repeated. All that information is repeated in the sense of, first it was the plan, what you will do, and then what the people did do, right? And so there was a collection, and everybody was generous-hearted, and they brought more material than was going to be required for building the tabernacle. People gave. They gave silver, they gave gold, they gave copper, they gave the beautiful blue thread and the crimson thread, and the materials and the goat skins and the tachash skins and everything. And they fashioned the menorah and the table and the altar, and everything came together. And here in this week's Torah portion, finally they put it all together. They assembled all of it. They really brought it all, and then Moses himself, who had sort of commissioned the work amongst many people, and the work was supervised by the great artist and craftsman Bezalel, who was only 13 years old when he did this job, but he was endowed with a great spirit of prophecy and understanding and knowledge and art and craftsmanship. And then Moses supervised the actual putting it all together, and then boom, it was there, the Mishkan. We translate it as tabernacle, But a more accurate translation might be the dwelling. And when it was finally put together, right? When the people had all worked together as a society, as a population, to build a dwelling, to make a dwelling in this world for Hashem, for God, then God's Kavod filled the dwelling. Kavod will enter the dwelling. It's going to be one Kavod or another. Either we're going to live in a godless world where we're subject, to unknown and unexplained phenomena that just batters us around and we're always in reaction mode. Or we are going to build with purpose and determination a place of holiness. And then holiness will fill that dwelling. My friends, since the temple was destroyed, right, about 1,200 years after the events of the children in the desert putting together the tabernacle, it stood, first there was a tabernacle for 400 years, even once they entered the land of Israel, and then they had the first temple for 400 years, then about 70 years off, and then the second temple for another 400 years, and then finally it all ended. There was no temple, and then the sages of the Talmud had to put together a Judaism that would be portable and would not be temple-based, rather it would be prayer-based, right? And since then, we have been building and fashioning a home, a dwelling that should have holiness in it, right? And if we fill our dwelling with holiness, then hopefully, please God, that's all the Kavod we need in our dwellings. The glory of God is something we invite into our homes, and we make it happen in our homes by treating each other with love as holy beings, thanking our Creator, making blessings before we eat, speaking blessings after we eat, and understanding that we are here, we are souls, right? We don't have souls, we are souls, and we are here to fulfill a mission. What is that mission? It's to make this whole world a dwelling for Hashem. And we begin with our homes. We must bring holiness into our homes. Then the Kavod of God will fill our homes. And then God willing, the more of us do that, then maybe that this tremor that's going through the world right now, the Kavod virus, will have done its job, and we don't need any more. We don't need any more scientific Kavod. We just want that spiritual Kavod. It's the same sounding word if you're joining us now. But that's the point. Kavod will fill our homes. May it be the glory of God and not some disease that we're fighting now and we're going to beat it off. But us being stuck in our homes and this is a Shabbat like no other. Right? There's never been a Shabbat like this. Even last week was not as intense as this. Everything is shut down. People have no choice but to have a full stop on this Shabbat. But even with a full stop, and if we turn off our screens and we're not going out and we're not, doing any of the things that we might have done on another Shabbat, everyone can keep Shabbat now. But it won't be Shabbat if we don't also take a moment to stop and say, thank you. Thank you that I was given this day. Thank you that I was sent this message. Thank you that I'm alive to have this day. Thank you that I'm part of a community. Thank you that I'm breathing, right? This Kavod disease, it attacks the respiratory system. That is no coincidence. It takes your breath away. I'm breathing. My soul is within me. I'm thankful. We've got to give thanks. How does that connect with this day's page of the Talmud? We're holding by Shabbos, page 15. Page 15 of Tractate Shabbos. We're still in chapter 1. We're studying the 4th Mishnah. We're looking at an odd story about a bunch of decrees that were issued in an attic, the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah during the Second Temple period, that resolved some of the disagreements between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai. So now we're looking at the commentary on that Mishnah, which is not really a law. It's just telling us that 18 matters were resolved in that attic that day. As part of that discussion, we look a little bit closer at the disagreements between Hillel and Shammai. These disagreements that proliferated in Israel were disagreements between the followers of Hillel and the followers of Shammai. Let's take a look at Hillel and Shammai themselves. They were among the pairs of Israel. So during all these generations, the Torah was transmitted from Moses, eventually to the sages, and eventually to us. But there were a bunch of pairs, and we see this in Pirkei Avos. It's actually Avot number 1, the transmission of Torah from God to Moses at Sinai, from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua, I believe, to the judges, from the judges to the men of the Great Assembly, etc. And then there were a bunch of pairs in each generation. Right? There was never one spiritual leader. There were two. And the point of there being two was that they would disagree with each other and would sharpen each other's thinking. And the Torah was always something that we argued about and looked into, turned it over and over and over from different perspectives so that we could learn more from the Torah in every generation. So there were at least 18 matters that the followers of Hillel and Shammai disagreed on vehemently, and actually many more. But Hillel and Shammai themselves disagreed on 3 things. And they seem like small technical things, and yet we learn from them. They disagreed about how much dough a person has to make in order to bake bread, especially for Shabbos, before they're obligated to separate some of that dough and give it to the priest as a gift to the Kohen, a gift to the priest. Taking a bit of dough out of the bread that we're going to bake and giving it to the priest is called challah. Challah is the taking of the dough in order to give it to the priest. Now we call the bread that we bake the challah, but challah actually refers to the taking of a small part, give it to the priest. But if you're only going to make 1 loaf of bread, you don't have that much dough, you're not obligated. If you're going to make 50 loaves of bread, you're definitely going to be obligated. So the question is, what's the minimum amount of dough that you need to be baking in order to have to separate a gift and give it to the priest? They disagreed. I think Shammai said, one of them said 1 kav and the other said 2 kav. But our sages said both were wrong, right? We follow Hillel and Shammai and everything, but in these 3 disagreements, our sages stepped in and said, well, we don't do like this one or like that one. We're not going to settle their dispute that they didn't settle. We actually have an answer. In this case, a compromise. The sages stepped in and said, you know what, we can take a number that's halfway between what one says and what the other says. And then there was a second question they disagreed on how much water, drawn water, added to a mikvah, right? So remember, a mikvah is for immersion in order for a person to purify him or herself. And it has to have a minimum measure of 40 sa. So we're not going to get into exact measurements right now what that means, but the minimum is 40 of this unit of volume called a sa or a se'ah. And if you have less than that, it's disqualified. But if you have a little less than that and you add water to it, and then you make up the volume, okay. But where does the water that you're adding to it come from? It's drawn water, not from a mikvah. Well, how much of the drawn water, which we know we can't immerse ourselves in drawn water, we learned that yesterday, but can you use drawn water to make up the missing volume so that the mikvah has the minimum amount? Answer, yes, but if you use too much of this water that is drawn from the non-mikvah source, then it will disqualify the mikvah. And what is that minimum amount of drawn water added to the living waters of a mikvah that would disqualify it? They disagreed on that amount. And our sages said, no, neither like this nor like that. We actually got an answer from 2 weavers from the Dung gate. What? 2 weavers from the Dung gate settled the question that was disputed between Hillel and Shammai? Yes. Why? Because these weavers were very sharp. Their job was considered a very lowly job. It's not comparable to what a weaver is today. But these weavers from the Dung gate, like, they were not Torah scholars. That's the point. And they were just sort of, lowly working people. I'm not adding the word lowly, but here they're making a point that in their world they did not have a lot of prominence. But these two weavers remembered a ruling that was given by Shammai and Hillel, who were the pair of spiritual leaders of the nation in the generation before Hillel and Shammai. And the point here is that these two weavers from the Dung gate, their Torah eclipses the Torah of Shammai and Hillel, even though Shammai and Hillel are such lofty leaders, because their Torah is true, because it is grounded in the previous generations and the knowledge of the elders that they received and faithfully transmitted. And so Torah, you can imagine in the ancient world, the class system was, it was unbreakable, right? I mean, there were nobles and there were serfs. There were the aristocrats and the poor people, and there was no mixing between them. But in a Torah world, what matters is not who you're born to, who your parents are, what your background is. You don't even have to have been born Jewish. But if you commit to God and make yourself a Jew, if you have to convert in order to do that, but if you commit to learning Torah, and you come up with a Torah that is true, so then you get the full respect of the nation, even above the most respected people, because it is a meritocracy, one of the original meritocracies in world history. And finally, the third disagreement between Hillel and Shammai was on the retroactive tumah, retroactive ritual impurity of a woman who sees, that she has had her monthly visitor, and she finds some blood, but she didn't feel when that flow began. So the question is, well, what about the things because when a woman is having her time of the month, she's tameh, she's ritually impure. If she were to touch a sacrifice, a goat that was designated to be brought as a sacrifice in the temple, she would actually invalidate the goat. It's just a kind of ritual impurity. A woman who's menstruating can't touch a sacrifice that's going to be brought in the temple. Okay, well, if she finds the spot of blood today and she happened to touch that goat yesterday, has the goat been rendered impure? How long is the retroactive tumah going to attach to the woman who finds that she's in her time now? And Shammai and Hillel disagreed about that. One of them said that it doesn't matter. In other words, that what she did yesterday is irrelevant. And the other said, no. Since her last examination, no matter how long ago that was, the last time that she knew that she was pure, everything between now and that point in the past, if she touched it, it would be invalidated. And the sages overruled both of them and said, no, we don't say she's pure, that anything she touched yesterday is automatically pure. And we don't say that everything she touched since her last examination is impure, but rather the retroactive period, as it were, is 24 hours or less if she had a self-examination less time in the past than 24 hours ago. So this is a case where the sages overruled, right, their two leaders. Where the two leaders disagreed, the people stepped in and said, wait a minute, if our leaders can't agree on what the law is, then we're going to step in and use all our wisdom to figure it out. We also have, and this maybe will connect back to where we started, kavod in the world, kavod in the home, right? So remember, if we don't render if we don't render unto God the glory that is His, if we don't acknowledge God and give thanks, give God kavod, right? Then the kavod of this plague will enter the home. Kavod, the Hebrew word meaning glory or honor, and kavod, as we know, the name of this disease. It's not a coincidence it has that name. So in our Gemara that we're learning, there were 6 decrees that were issued by the sages on matters of uncertainty. We're getting back to matters which disqualify terumah, the portion of the grain that is set aside for the priest, right? A farmer sets aside a certain amount of the grain. he gives it to the Levite gives it to the priest. It's called terumah. So, if these 6 things come into definite contact with that grain, it will render the grain unfit. It cannot be given to the priest as terumah, and in fact, it needs to be burned lest somebody come to use it by mistake. So these are 6 matters of uncertainty. We don't know that there's impurity in them, but there could be. And so if the terumah came into definite contact with this uncertain source of impurity, the sages by decree, by rabbinic decree as opposed to a biblical prohibition, render the terumah unfit. These are a field that was known that a body was buried there, and then they plowed the field. So the idea is that when they plowed the field, the corpse that was buried in the field might have got sort of mangled up in the plow, and little bits of that corpse that's buried there, like the skeleton, little bits of bone of the body that was buried in that field, could come to be all over the field or any place in the field. And so anything that passes over that field, like close to the ground, we're going to render it unfit. It's been made impure because that whole field has a status of uncertainty. There could be a dead body, which would give corpse tumah, right? The strongest source of ritual impurity. So the plowed field with a corpse in it, a clod of earth from the nations, meaning people in the Holy Land are going to be careful with matters of tahara and tumah, of purity and impurity. But outside of Israel, people don't have those laws. They don't need to follow those laws. They're not doing anything wrong by not following those laws. But because those laws are not adhered to, so if dirt from outside of Israel comes into contact with terumah, it will render it unfit. Clothes of an ignorant person, right? So a Jew who doesn't know the laws, he could easily have touched something that was impure, and so the sages decreed that his clothing is considered impure, and if the clothing of an ignorant person touches the terumah, it renders the terumah unfit. A vessel that we don't know who owns it, like a found vessel. You can imagine just a pot that showed up on the door. We don't know where it came from. It might have belonged to somebody who allowed it to touch something impure. So if it touches the terumah, impure. Spittle, right? A person's spit. So a person who allows their spit to come into contact with the terumah, we don't know where they've been. We don't know what they've touched. Spit is a liquid. As we'll learn in our journey, you need liquid in order to convey certain kinds of impurity. And so spit, and the 6th category is urine. So if the spit or the urine of a person comes into contact with the terumah, it renders it unfit. Not because spit and urine are gross, right, and that the liquids themselves are disgusting to us, but rather because the person whose spit or whose urine came into contact with the terumah might have the status of a zav. So that's a man who is, or there's a zava also, but people who have had certain kinds of bodily emissions are rendered impure until they go through a purification process. And during the time of their impurity, this is where a man can have the same kind of impurity as a woman who is menstruating if he's had a nighttime seminal emission. These are obviously a lot of technical things that we'll discuss in more detail during our journey. But the point right now is that all 6 sources are things where we're not sure if impurity exists or not, but because it's such a likely possibility, right? It's not a zero possibility. It's not anywhere near zero. It's a definite possibility that the thing is impure. And so the sages decreed that terumah, which must be impure, if it comes into definite contact with these uncertain sources of impurity, we're going to render the terumah, the portion of grain set aside for the priest, as impure. But if there's some of this grain that's set aside for the priest, and it is uncertain whether it came into contact with these uncertain sources of impurity, then we don't say that so it's two levels of uncertainty, right? So if we're taking an example, right, like some dirt from a field that had a corpse in it that was plowed over. Okay, so that field might have a bit of a dead body in it, right? Because the body was buried, but then they plowed it. I mean, this goes on all over the place in Europe, right? There were Jewish cemeteries. The Jews were all killed or left, and then the people who live there go in and plow up the cemetery. It's terrible. It's a total desecration, but it has happened. So what happens to the bodies that were buried there? Little bits of those bodies are mixed in with the dirt. So the dirt, if you have a dirt from that field, odds are there's no bit of bone or a bit of body in that dirt, but there could be. So that's one level of uncertainty. And then you have some of the grain that's set aside for the priest, and it's one case if it definitely came into contact with that dirt from the field, and another case where it might have come into contact with dirt from the field. For instance, like we had the grain in a bag set aside for the priest, we're on our way to the priest, we take a rest because it's a long walk to reach the priest, right? We don't have cars, it's a walk for several days to go give it to the priest. We put the bag down, and it turns out, there was some dirt from that plowed field, or we put it on the plowed field, or we put it on the border of the plowed field. So if we know that grain came into contact with the field, unfit. If it might have touched the dirt from the plowed field, then either we're going to render it pure in some cases, meaning that we're saying uncertain contact with an uncertain source, not good enough, we leave it alone. We consider that it's still pure. Or, sorry, I do have allergies this time of year. Or we're going to hold it in abeyance. Okay, so we have uncertain contact with an uncertain source. In some situations, we'll say, we don't know. We're not going to say it's impure, but we're going to put it aside and see if we can get more evidence that the contact happened or that the contact didn't happen. And if we never get more evidence, well, then eventually enough time will pass that perhaps, this grain or whatever we've set aside decays and is no longer fit to be a gift to the priest. And then the period of abeyance, right, of suspension of judgment will end. Sorry. I always get allergies in the spring. Here we go. As far as I know, not covered. If at some point, God forbid, I should contract the disease, I've already thought about this. I'll keep doing the shows to the best of my ability, and I'll let you know how it's going with me. But thank God, no symptoms, no fever, no cough. This is just allergies. Okay. And that's it. That's what I've got for us today. I'm going to, but the point is, in terms of levels of uncertainty. So right now, we're all being hyper cautious, paranoid cautious. That's what we need to do, right? The inconvenience of the many to protect the vulnerable few. At some point, we're going to need to be careful about multiplying uncertainties, right? In the sense that we're not there yet. Right now, whatever, like if you feel like you're being way too paranoid, you're doing it the right way. But at some point, I imagine there's going to be an impact, which is there's going to be multiple impacts, right? There's the impact of the disease, and then there's the rippling impact of a shutdown economy that also is going to hurt a lot of people. And so I imagine at some point, we might bring this kind of thinking to bear on, okay, if there's an uncertainty, we're going to just totally be careful and be stringent to make sure that we don't contract the disease or become a vector to bring the disease to somebody who's vulnerable. But when we're saying there's an uncertainty upon an uncertainty, maybe upon an uncertainty, like we don't know, I can't even formulate the example of what I'm talking about, but if you can follow my logic, right, it's uncertain whether a person has contracted it. If it's further uncertain that they've even gone outside where they might have contracted it, like that's already two levels of abstraction, like they're safe enough, And so in that case, for example, you could bring groceries to somebody who needs it because it's more certain that eventually they'll starve if we don't bring them food. You understand what I'm saying? When we're weighing relative impacts, at some point we have to start taking into account whether we're just dealing with uncertainty or uncertainty upon uncertainty, weighed against the certain, harsh impact of not reaching out to a person and getting them what they need. Okay, that's what I have for us today. Let me just see it. So some longer comments. Are they questions? Elizabeth Meditash says, interesting that menstruating is considered impure when it is the absolute threshold telling of life at all. Very twisted, just saying. Yes, remember, it's very important to understand that when we're talking about tumah and tahara, purity and impurity, we use those words with like very positive and negative connotations, and we would say, well, to say that something is impure is to say that it's dirty. But that's not what these matters mean. It means that when these things happen, right? I mean, like the vessel of a human life, a body, right? We say that a corpse conveys the strongest kind of tumah, the strongest kind of ritual impurity. But we don't look at a dead body as a filthy thing that we have to get rid of and that we would burn. God forbid, right? Jewish law absolutely prohibits burning the body which carried a soul through its journey in a human lifetime. We don't burn a body. It's very, very much prohibited in Jewish law to cremate a body, right? So we treat it with the utmost respect. So this thing that imparts impurity, which we treat with so much reverence and respect, how do we reconcile that contradiction? And the understanding is these laws, it's not so much, you can't translate them into, cleanliness and filth or the English sense of purity and impurity. We're talking about laws that have rippling effects, not so much on what they are, whether a thing is tameh or tahor, whether it's pure or impure, but on what behavior, right, from us that status produces, right? Because people were so mindful of these laws of tumah and tahara, it causes a certain mindfulness to come into everyday life. Food isn't just food. Food is something you have to be very careful about. Am I keeping this food away from any of these possible sources of impurity that would render it fit for some things and unfit for others? To be that mindful of our food and that mindful of these, talking about tumah tahara, it's totally invisible. The thing that something could become impure, it's not even as tangible as a virus. There is no actual transfer of a object, of some kind of tangible energy called purity or impurity. It's just a system of rules that results in mindful behavior, right? And if you've gone through, whatever it is that rendered you tameh, okay, you're impure. So right now, because of that, you can't go into the temple. But because you're in that state, you now are forced to, or you might say, are given the privilege of going through a purification process. So some people might say, oh, well, who wants to have to go through a purification process? That sucks. I'd rather just get on with my life and go play golf and hang out with my kids. But actually, sometimes going through a process elevates us to places that we wouldn't have been otherwise, right? Going through a purification process is a gift. And perhaps that's what the whole world is going through right now, right? The culture that runs our planet right now has been so diligent in removing God's name from the world and saying that everything can be explained by science and markets, etc. And now everything is being shaken. This gentle tremor is going throughout the world. It's a reset. And it's a gift if it becomes a purification process that makes us more mindful of our blessings, reconnects us with our Creator, gives us a pause to say thank you, and then gives us newfound appreciation for every good in our lives. That is all I've got. My friends, I'm wishing you such a sweet Shabbos. Such a sweet Shabbos. Please turn off the screens at sundown tonight. Just unplug it all, even if you're alone. And how much more if you've got loved ones around you. Unplug it all. You know, we have a tradition that if all the children of Israel, if all the Jews would keep one Shabbat properly, it would shift the world. And if they kept 2 Shabbats properly, the Messiah would come. We'd enter the Messianic age. We've never been closer to having all the Jewish people keep Shabbos properly. You're home anyway. Eat some good food. Thank God for it. Bless the Sabbath day by making a bracha over some Sabbath wine. Hopefully you have some wine. You actually can make a kiddush without wine if necessary. But sanctify the day. Thank God for it. Dwell on what's important. Give glory to God in our homes. Kavod to God, right, in our homes. Let God's kavod fill our homes, fill our dwellings, as God's kavod filled the tabernacle, the dwelling, the tent of dwelling, the Mishkan in the desert. And who knows what miracles might await us when we come out of Shabbos tomorrow.